Get ready to set sail with us in the smooth sounds of Yacht Rock. This is a movie like is so us. Like few things cry out us like a documentary about Yacht Rock. And so I'm thrilled that this exists in the world. It is streaming now on HBO. It is called Yacht Rock, Dockumentary, DOCK, documentary. Tell us about it, Alonso.
Steely Dan.
The Doobie Brothers.
Toto.
Kenny Loggins.
Christopher Cross.
Michael fucking McDonald.
Yeah, so this movie kind of gets the jokey stuff out of the way first. The term yacht rock was coined by a mid-2000s online comedy series, which sort of took all these disparate musicians that nobody had really made into a genre before and called it yacht rock. So it's the sort of heavily produced and yet somehow also mellow sounds of like Steely Dan, Toto, Michael McDonald, Kenny Loggins, Christopher Cross. These are sort of the giants of this subcategory of music that was retroactively kind of given a category. And it's become a channel on Sirius XM, and you have like, you know, they show you clips of a band called Yachtley Crew that does like mellow covers of Motley Crue songs. And,
no, I've seen Yachtley Crew.
Oh, you have? Okay.
Yes, they play yacht rock songs. They don't play Motley Crue songs.
Oh,
They're all dressed in captain's outfits, and they do like legit great cover songs of all these songs.
Okay, good to know. We never hear them, so I didn't know that. Anyway, so they sort of they give you like 5 or 10 minutes about how this sort of jokey phenomenon, but then it's like, but let's talk about the music, because the music is actually really great. And so we get to know like the people involved. Michael McDonald is here, Kenny Loggins is here, Christopher Cross is here, the Porcaros, you know, from Toto, and David Paich. And you know, it's about the sort of the evolution of this sound, how it turns up in places you might not expect, like the Thriller album.
I didn't know that.
You know, and how they don't necessarily all love the name. There's at least one person who very adamantly refuses to be included in the documentary because it's called Yacht Rock.
That was funny.
But watch this, I was like, oh shit, this is the soundtrack to my childhood. Like, it was like watching Decline of Western Civilization with Dave White, because it was just like, oh, I had that album, you know, and that stuff was my jam. Even like the sort of lesser stuff, like Boz Scaggs and, you know, Pablo Cruz, like these were albums I had. Poco, yes, Ambrosia. You know,
love Ambrosia.
They talk about the doobie bounce, which is the thing I didn't know about, which is the sort of like the, you know, they start with What a Fool Believes, the whole na 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 na, and how like that kind of pops up in all these other songs of that moment, because that song was such a huge hit and so influential.
Robbie Dupree, Steal Away.
Exactly, which he literally does. The fact that like Michael McDonald and Kenny Loggins sit down for the first time to write a song, and it's What a Fool Believes, and they win a Grammy for it, and they like don't work together again for a while, because it's like, how do you follow up that? And they run into each other like, let's just sit down and write a song, and it'll be shit, and we can get that out of the way, and then we can collaborate again. And then the shit song turns out to be also another classic. So, you know, just a lot of fun tidbits, and really, I think, acknowledging the sort of like jokiness of the term yacht rock, but at the same time really being respectful about the music itself and how it came together and how super popular it was and bled out into so many other things, and how like it becomes this huge influence to like R&B and even hip hop later, you know, Warren G and his whole thing with the Michael McDonald song, you know. I was fascinated, but I mean, I was, as you said, this movie's so us. I was completely on board. You know, you had me at, you know, exactly. You had me at da 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 da. You know, so.
So this is my childhood too. I'm a little younger than you, but this still reminds me of like Carpool in the late 70s and like a little bit in the early 80s. It's interesting to see what MTV does to this whole genre once we have to actually also see these people. You know, they weren't all ready for it, and they also maybe weren't like game to play around. Like you hear from Michael McDonald talking about how silly it seemed to have to like craft a narrative visually to go with the song. Yeah, a lot of really fun anecdotes here, and also a lot of appreciation for the musicianship and just like the recording prowess here, like the meticulous nature of what was happening in the studio. I like the one anecdote from someone saying like the Steely Dan Asia album is what stereo salesmen would put on when they wanted you to buy speakers, because it was like recorded so perfectly and with such a high level of craft there. A lot
just listen to what Michael McDonald's doing in the background of Peg, and it's just like, what is even happening here?
Yeah, I still love Yacht Rock with zero irony. I think a lot of people who go to see Yachtley Crew or listen to the music do it in like a jokey, like, oh, even like the guy who is the voice of the Yacht Rock radio on Sirius XM was like,
I hate that guy.
Aboard,
yeah, he's doing like this sort of Thurston Howell thing. It's so annoying.
But the music is really good. So I'm happy we have people like Questlove here to speak to the work that goes into the songwriting, and Fred Armisen speaks to that as well. We have a couple of different critics and musicians who speak to like how these artists took from Black music and like that is the R&B and jazz influence here.
Right.
Questlove is of course encyclopedic and can talk about any genre with total, authenticity here and authoritativeness. I think some of the talking heads aren't all that helpful. Like some of them are totally random and contribute nothing. Also, this is not comprehensive and it never could be, but there are glaring omissions like, where is Brandy? You're a fine girl. Right?
Well, yeah, I mean, sure. I think that probably counts as like a one-off, because do you even know who recorded that song?
Looking Glass.
Okay, great. Can you name another Looking Glass song?
But like, my life, my love, and my lady is the sea. Come on.
Yes. Again, though, that's the guys who created the Yacht Rock thing could have called it something else. They just landed on Yacht Rock, which is a perfect name in some ways, but also it is reductive in others. I just like the idea, because I had watched that series and that sort of gave me a new appreciation for this music. And they talked about how we were like a bunch of broke actors and comedians, and we would go to Amoeba and buy dollar records, and the dollar records at that time were all these like soft rock albums from the 70s. And we start looking at the liner notes, you realize that everybody's playing on each other's things. Like I love the idea that people were poo-pooing Christopher Cross because he wasn't as cool as Steely Dan, but then you look at all these people who worked on the Steely Dan albums worked on the Christopher Cross album, and it was produced by Michael O'Mardian, who worked with Steely Dan. So just all the sort of incestuous wrapping around of all these different things, and that there was just enough of a community of people like, hey, come work on this thing with me, and I'll come sing back up on your thing, and yada da. And I was also fascinated. I think there's a whole doc in just the Christopher Cross story. I mean, here's a guy who out of the gate wins like all the Grammys for his very first album, and then where do you go from there but down,
Yeah. And I think if you've seen the Wrecking Crew documentary or the Muscle Shoals documentary, you'll come away with a great appreciation here as well for like the session guys who are so reliable, who knew each other so well that they could just like sit down and just jam, and like any genre they knew each other so well, and they're operating at such a high level, and it makes you appreciate things that maybe you didn't think about when you hear these songs on the radio or in the dentist's office or wherever it is. So
this music is like the next generation of the Wrecking Crew, basically. Like everything they were doing in the 60s, these guys were carrying over into the 70s.
Yeah, I love all this stuff too, and I make Nick listen to it, and he's like, "Why do you like Yacht Rock?" And there's just something sort of comforting about it, even though a lot of these songs, as somebody points out, are about like men opening up their hearts and getting emo,
having feelings, being allowed to have feelings in the macho 70s, and I think that's a valid theory. I mean, for me, it is a great deal of it is nostalgia. It is being in the car and being driven to a swim meet, but
it's totally carpool music,
I still love it. It's great stuff.
I do too. Okay, so then what's your number on this?
I mean, just out of the sheer enjoyment that it gave me, and maybe just me, I would say an 8.
I was going to say an 8 as well. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know how this is for people who approach the material cold and don't have a feeling for the music, but I think by the end of it, you're going to acknowledge that like some of these songs are like stone cold jams, and that you are always going to love, Ambrosia's You're the Biggest Part of Me,
I love that song. Well, De La Soul thought so. Warren G thought so. So I'm glad that they acknowledge all that. Anyway, the Yacht Rock documentary is on HBO. Go check it out.